Hey folks, David Stewart here. Last night I watched a movie. That movie was called The Week Of. It's an Adam Sandler movie. It was penned by Adam Sandler and Robert Smigel, directed by Robert Smigel, I believe. It could be Robert Smigel. I don't really remember. I think he did some stuff with Saturday Night Live like 20 years ago, 30 years ago or something. But I'm going to call him Robert Smigel because I like to imagine him as a somewhat diminutive and pathetic character, and that's because this movie sucks. This is actually one of the worst comedies that I've seen in quite some time. But of course, the lesson is, how does it suck and why does it suck? Because this movie is a failure on almost every level I can conceive of. It's a failure of story. It's a big failure of comedy. It's very unfunny. I didn't laugh one single time. I watched it with my wife, who laughs at everything and has pretty low standards and loves comedies. And she didn't laugh at all either. And she's like, what? How did this train wreck get made? Which is a whole different question from why is it bad? But I want to try to answer the question of why is it bad? It really all comes down to the writing. The writing on this movie is a huge failure. And that's the thing about comedy. I'm going to skip with this movie the normal numerical system that I do for most of my reviews, where I talk about production and this kind of stuff, because production's not a significant aspect of this movie. And most of what would make this kind of movie successful would be not the production aspects, but the writing, the comedy aspects. And comedy really originates from the writing. The setups and the payoffs, the punchlines, the jokes, those sorts of things, all of those were off. There were some things about production that I didn't like, and I want to mention those. The first one was they constantly went between a normal cinematography style with like a fixed camera and normal editing between shots, and this kind of shaky documentary style handheld camera thing, which I just despised. It was distracting in every single scene that they had it. I think they did it because they wanted to shoot in hallways and other kinds of tight areas, and it just doesn't work. And it's part of one of the biggest problems with the movie was this mismatching of tone between scenes and even within scenes, and the documentary style camera kind of mixed in with regular cinematography of a fixed point variety was really kind of jarring. The other problem was actually the editing. The editing was too tight in a way that inhibited whatever comedy was there from being able to land for someone who might have thought the jokes were funny. So you have a setup, you're supposed to have a tense moment, then you have a punchline or a payoff when you're doing sitcom type stuff. Not to get too scientific about comedy, but that's usually the way that it works. And in this case, you have all the wrong timing being shown with the camera. So you have characters reacting and standing there for things that don't matter or aren't related to a joke or a setup, and then you have cases where the punchline is presented and then you edit away from it really quickly so that nobody has a time to even consider what the joke might have been about. Editing, when it comes to comedy, and especially if you're going to write like a joke factory style comedy, like something like 30 Rock. 30 Rock as a show worked because they were able to fire those jokes off in a way that the timing ended up working. If the timing had been off with a show like that, it would have been a whole lot less entertaining and a whole lot less funny. So that's the big thing with production. I'm not going to give a score to that. There were some bad production elements. Like, there's no soundtrack to talk about. They just used pop songs. I didn't know any of them. I didn't like any of them. So I don't know. I have nothing really to say about any of the other production aspects besides those two. The big problem, like I said, though, is the writing, and it all comes down to the way the writing failed on almost every single level. So you had bad dialogue, you had bad jokes, you had bad timing, not just with the editing, but the way the acting ended up trying to execute those bad jokes. You had a story that was completely absent tension and avoided any kind of storyline that could have brought some interest or tension to the viewer. So it's completely flat and boring. You have this really strong mixed tone. You have, at one point, you're trying to do a really straightforward, realist kind of comedy, sitcom, situational comedy, and then on the other hand, you have these absurdist scenes and these absurdist moments. The movie opens up with Chris Rock as a heart surgeon performing heart surgery and getting a call from Adam Sandler, and him somehow taking this phone call and like holding the phone with bloody hands, leaving the person's chest cavity open. And that's an absurdist moment, and it misses completely because We don't have anything else that draws in an absurdist moment. The timing's off. There's no absurdist jokes leading up to that. The characters are talking completely seriously while this chest cavity's open, and it ends up just being a cross tone. The seriousness and the absurdist, it just didn't work as a cross tone. Sometimes you could maybe have it, but in this case it really just did not work well at all, and then it undermines a lot of the basic, I guess, world building, you might say, because Chris Rock's character is supposed to be an extremely rich surgeon, but of course he's not going to be a rich and successful surgeon if he's leaving people's hearts open to take phone calls, right? And the amount of wealth that he's presented as having actually is not realistic for even an extremely high quality surgeon, and that's because surgeons live in mediocristan. They don't have a super scalable income the way an entrepreneur does. So he should have been an entrepreneur if they're going to have him be extremely rich. Don't know why they decided on surgeon, but it's one of the problems. And this goes through the entire movie. You have characters having somewhat serious discussions. You have a Saturday Night Live feel of absurdism, and then you have these absurdist moments where, like, Adam Sandler picks up his great uncle from the airport who doesn't have legs and has to carry him around because he can't open up the wheelchair, and it just comes off as cringy and weird rather than absurdist because the documentary style camera doesn't lend itself well to it. It's like they were trying to do Spinal Tap at some moments and scenes where it's like a mockumentary thing, and then at other points they were just trying to do a straightforward standard comedy, and none of it ended up working. So that's a big thing there. And then finally they had this big disconnect from what they wanted to portray. They wanted to show a super successful black man, and so they made him a surgeon, but his success was beyond what a surgeon would actually be able to achieve. Even a very competent one would be able to be, pretty wealthy and very successful and have money, but not the amount of money that they portray. They portray him as somebody who lives in extremistan as far as how much money they make, rather than a surgeon can only perform so many surgeries, so that there's kind of an upper limit on their income. You also have this Jewish family that Adam Sandler is like the patriarch of in the movie, that they're constantly like broke, except they have this huge house that can hold like 30 people with basements and like 20 bedrooms and stuff. So you have a crossing, and they live on Long Island, which is not, it's not the most expensive place to live in New York, but it's certainly not the cheapest. So this broke Jewish head of household actually doesn't appear to be that broke, and it's kind of like you had a bunch of rich people from Hollywood making a movie about people they didn't understand, which when you feel that, when you understand that, when you watch it, you're going to see like, yeah, that's totally what it is, which is a different thing from somebody who's an outsider and makes a movie about regular people. So if you think of the movie like Clerks by Kevin Smith, his breakout movie, the movie that really, I don't know, put him on the map. It's shot in black and white. The production value is very low, and it's about very basic people in New Jersey, of which he was one, right? He wasn't a Hollywood elite at the time he made Clerks. And so the further away you get from those roots, the less connected you are in being able to understand how regular people think and act. That's just something I think is probably pretty prevalent in Hollywood. The further away you get from the common man, the less you understand about him, even if that's where you started. And that's kind of the feel I get from this particular movie. They didn't understand what they wanted to portray. Now, the tone, the story, let's talk about those couple things, because the bad dialogue and the bad jokes, those can be hit or miss. If you fire off enough jokes, usually some of them are going to land. The big problem with the jokes is that there's all these setups that just don't have any payoffs. There's this painting of Adam Sandler's like great grandmother that's in a hotel room, because Adam Sandler is trying to make this hotel room nice for the Chris Rock character, who's this rich surgeon. And why he put it there, it's never explained. The setup doesn't have a payoff. Chris Rock kind of acknowledges it to try to create a payoff, but they move past it so quickly that we just miss it. There's this creepy neighbor who has this apparent back relation with the bride, Adam Sandler's daughter. It just doesn't go anywhere. They set it up and they don't pull any story out of it. There's no story related to it, and there's no jokes related to it, and there probably could have been a very rich cache of jokes if you really wanted to to dig into a character like that, like kind of a creepy guy who's been pining for his neighbor forever. There could be a lot of comedy there, and they just didn't do it. They introduced it and then did nothing with it. There's this 12-year-old DJ. We're going to have a 12-year-old DJ at the wedding. They don't do anything with it. So they have this setup. They don't pull any comedy out of it. Every setup, you're like, oh, this could be funny. And then they don't do anything with it. They have this point where they take an 11-year-old to a bachelor party. Now, if I see this thing, it's like, we have to take this 11-year-old to a bachelor party, I can think of like a lot of funny things that could happen, that people are trying to restrict their behavior. People are doing things in front of an 11-year-old, and someone's trying to explain them to an 11-year-old. There's lots of comedy that could be had. They just skipped over that. The 11-year-old was in the scene with strippers and booze and all, depravity, but nothing... there's no comedy derived from it. So it ends up just coming off as a very bizarre and perverse scene, is the best way I can describe it. There's a bachelorette party that they set up and then they do nothing with, other than show like penis-shaped lipstick and things. It's really bizarre. They have this old veteran that the backstory is like he's dishonorably discharged, and they never use that for any kind of payoff. The payoff is like people thought his legs blew up in the war instead of having them amputated because he was diabetic. And that wouldn't have been nearly as powerful as if it had been discovered that he was dishonorably discharged. They hint at that, they set it up, but then they don't have the story pay it off. They have a hotel manager who just is always like, yes, 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 and they don't really do anything with him. It could have been an interesting setup for a character. Maybe he doesn't speak English, maybe he's agreeing to everything because of some other storyline that has to be revealed, but it's not... They don't go anywhere with it. They don't do anything. It's just a guy that might have been mildly funny in a Saturday Night Live skit for like 30 seconds, and that's all the character is. There's this awkward maid of honor that runs through the movie, that everyone thinks all of her ideas are corny. It's a setup, but then there's no payoff from it. They just kind of go with her ideas, and there's no, like, it's a point where we could have conflict and tension, and then they just don't do anything with it. They have this character attribute of Chris Rock that he's like a womanizer, and he's always chasing women. They set it up, they bring him over to Adam Sandler's house, and then they do nothing with that. It just goes nowhere. They bring in a character trait, and then they don't exploit it at all. And we're kind of expecting that. We're kind of like, we see all these things like, oh, there could be so much comedy in this, and none of it happens. There's this scene where Adam Sandler gives this ride to a customer with his legless great uncle in the back of the car who needs to like use the bathroom, and there could have been all this setup with his job, like him losing his job. There could have been a bunch of tension and comedy added to the movie through some of the decisions they made. And a lot of the decisions they made for how characters act in the story is not believable, and it's not believable because it's presented as straight-laced, and the absurdism, it just doesn't mix. It's that mixed tone thing. So they don't pay off this customer being super embarrassed about him having to like change the diapers of his like 90-year-old great uncle. You have this thing where Adam Sandler is assuming that all black people are part of Chris Rock's family. And they set it up, and they have one little joke about it, and it's one of the few jokes that almost lands in the movie, and then they just don't really go anywhere with it or exploit it. There's not a sense of like tension between this family and Adam Sandler because he just assumed a couple of black guys off the street were part of their family. It just didn't go anywhere. So they had all these setups, no payoffs. There's probably like 20 more that I can think of. And the reason there's so many setups and no payoffs is that they tried to cram so many elements into this movie that it was impossible to find them all at the end of the movie. They created a billion threads and then tried to were able to keep like two of them to the end because the movie was so packed with elements. And it was packed with elements that don't really pay off. So they would have been a lot better if right from the get-go at the script writing stage, they cut half of those things out and really hammered home and had a lot of jokes for the remaining few. If they had just picked a few running gags and a few jokes and a few setups to really exploit, it probably would have ended up being a very successful comedy. But as it was, nothing. There's setups and no payoffs, and that feels really awkward and off. It's like, why are you telling me about Chris Rock's character if his character's not going to that's not going to cause him to do anything in the story. It causes him, he has like some kind of out of place moral reflection about it towards the end of the movie, but that's it. That's all you get. So that's the big problem with the movie. The writing is atrocious on almost every level that you can think of. And it's the lesson here, you don't have to have good production to make this movie work. If the jokes had been funny, it would have landed. There's also like some things are just cringy. They had this constant thing with like Adam Sandler and his wife yelling at each other in like angry, stereotypical Jew voices, I guess. What you would imagine like an East Coast Jew to yell like. They sounded like Seinfeld's mom, and it's awkward. It doesn't fit. And whenever you're watching comedy not land, and you're watching actors be like, here's something that's supposed to be funny, and it's not funny, it's kind of like watching a comedian bomb on stage. It's really not a good feeling. It's a feeling of the opposite of humor. Like I don't know how to describe this emotion, but you could think of, there's emotions that are like opposites of each other. Happy is the opposite of sad. Well, I don't know what the opposite of funny is, but this movie creates that emotion in me. And it's very rare that I feel anti-funny, feel some emotion from anti-funny. Like when I watch Trevor Noah talk, I feel anti-funny, whatever this emotion is, where it's like, not only are you not funny, you're the opposite of funny, not like sad, no, there's no other like basic emotion that's the opposite of humor. That's like, you're making me more serious about life. And that's kind of what this movie did. It's a very, very weird movie from that perspective. But if you do choose to watch it free on Netflix, you'll see these things that I'm talking about. But if you don't want to waste 2 hours of your life, I would say you could probably just safely skip it unless you're looking for a lesson on how to not write comedy. And lessons on how to not write comedy can be informative if you're trying to write comedy. The setup, the payoff, that's what works in sitcoms. Jokes that are funny, that are worded funny, that are timed well, that's what makes comedy work as well. This movie was missing on both of those, which made it just run flat. And there wasn't any kind of good story to pick it up. The story about this guy's daughter getting married, there was no tension in it. They're going to get married. Everything's going to be fine. There's never a doubt that somehow there's not going to be some success with it. The failure state is like, are we going to have the wedding? Where are we going to have the wedding? We were going to have it here. We're going to have it here. We're trying to have it in a nice place. There's never this idea that everything's going to fail, or that somebody's going to get divorced, or, there's no big failure state. And so the movie really lacks tension. The characters just kind of flop through an inevitable ending, which is this wedding happening and everybody being happy about it. That's it. Everybody's happy about people getting married. There's no tension. It's not like Meet the Parents. Meet the Parents has tension. It's not like Father of the Bride. Father of the Bride has tension. It's not like My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which has tension between the groom and the weird Greek family. There's none of that. All of that's missing, and it was all there. Like, all the setup was there for the story to have tension and payoff and a lot of comedy, and none of it was there. So that's probably more time than I need to spend analyzing why this movie doesn't work as a comedy. But there you go. That's the big problem. Doesn't work as a story, no tension. Doesn't work as a comedy because same reason, no tension. Jokes are bad. That's pretty much it. So thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you guys next time. Leave me your thoughts down below, and I appreciate it. And see you later.